One question I want to ask there is I'd love your insight on what makes someone a good macro thinker. And part of the reason I want to ask that is I think, at least from my perspective, it feels like when you focus on fundamentals, it seems easy to gut check reality in some sense when you're down in the details. But as you get further and further away, it feels like you're getting further and further abstracted. And I'm just curious, I guess, what are some of the qualities or what are some of the things that make someone a good macro thinker? What does that look like? What does that feel like?
There's not necessarily a checklist. Some of this is you kind of know what it feels like when you see it. And in particular, again, back to this idea of what's been your exposure to quality. I think I've been very fortunate to be exposed to some really remarkable macro thinkers in my career, investors, policymakers, academics. And sometimes it's like anything, you recalibrate your sensitivity from having seen something and you go, I know what that looks like. I might not know how to define it. So there's a little bit of that kicks in macro. But I would say there's a couple things that you can think about. One is you have to be someone who's a bit of a conceptual thinker and a bit more of a theorist than a pragmatist, I think. Or I shouldn't say more of, you have to have this in you. Ideally, you actually have both and you have an ability to marry theory and practice, but you can't not have some ability to be a big picture conceptual thinker by nature. And you probably know people who are like this in your life. You ask them a question and they turn it into a bigger question. The answer they give you is a bigger question. And so there's a little bit of that's just how people are. Some of that's hardwired. Some of that is, I think, what did you study in college and how did it shape your thinking? And just what have been your life experiences. I think the second thing that in my experience is a hallmark of really great macro thinkers is that they are creative. They're almost always people who end up looking at this very big picture and find original ways to formulate and stitch together ideas. Because the macro palette is so large. There are so many different things you can pull in to how you got to a conclusion. I find sometimes two macro investors might have an identical view on what's going to happen to like the currency in Brazil, but they get there in totally different ways. And they both actually can be correct about the causality and the outcome. And that's because the world is a complicated place. It's not that simple. There's a tremendous amount of complexity. And so part of the creativity is being able to identify within that complexity different recipes for getting to the same outcome. But the third thing is actually that really great macro thinkers have a gift for simplification and can cut through it and say, this is what doesn't matter, and then really focus on the handful of things that do to at least their worldview. And some of that is like, do they have an explanatory power that you can just see and feel? The best conceptual thinkers I know are actually teachers. And when you talk to them, it almost feels like you're being taught every time you sit down with these folks. But then the last thing I would say is, and some of this is just the nature of being an investor, and so I've maybe calibrated this to macro investing, is they have to be deeply curious, deeply curious. Because part of being macro is not taking for granted the way the world works. It's almost like some people just follow the rules by nature, and those people honestly tend not to be great macro thinkers because you have to be willing to go, well, wait, why on earth did that thing happen in the bond market? And wait, the fiscal policy is going that way, and there's this consensus that that means this is going to happen, but that doesn't actually seem like that's likely to hold in this moment or something like that. And so there just aren't predictable rules. And part of being good at macro in some respects is challenging, not even challenging, just asking questions about things that other people don't ask questions about and take for granted. And again, I suspect you know people who live like this. There are people you know in your life and they just sort of, you think they're out of their minds half the time, that you're like, why are you thinking about that? But that's very much what macro people do. And to some extent, that's what great just entrepreneurs do. I mean, I think there's an overlap between being a great entrepreneur and being a macro person and a macro thinker. Not always, because sometimes there are entrepreneurs that just, man, they dug deep into something and they kept scratching at that itch until they found something to change and then started building back from there. But a lot of times we talk to founders and you really figure out that the impetus for their entrepreneurial vision was a very big picture question.